Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I am reviewing Dune by Frank Herbert. I recently read Dune after 30 years, so this was my second read of the book. So it had been about 30 years since I'd read it. And I also recently took part in a discussion on Dune on Joanna's channel. And I had such a wonderful time talking about this classic with Joanna and Sarah from Sarah Reads and Mike from Mike's Book Reviews. I highly recommend you check out that discussion. I will put a link to it in the description below. It's just a wonderful time talking about this book, and most of the discussion has spoilers, but there is a section in the beginning that is non-spoiler, so you could check it out even if you haven't read Dune yet. This review will be non-spoiler, however. I'm going to avoid spoilers for anyone who might be interested in reading it with the film coming out relatively soon. So kind of an exciting time for Dune fans and also people who are new to the book. So, what did I think of Dune after 30 years? It had been a long time since I'd read it, and I had really good impressions from the first time, and these were, for the most part, very much confirmed by this reread. In fact, I think I loved it even more the second time, although it is a little hard to remember that far back. But I would say that it absolutely deserves its place as, for many people, the greatest work of science fiction ever. And it is also, as Mike observed during our discussion, it is a wonderful segue for fantasy lovers to get into science fiction, because it does contain a lot of elements in it that are very familiar and dear to fantasy fans. And it has aged extremely well, I would say. For something written in the 1960s, it feels very fresh. And this might be largely because of its influence. It has had a lot of influence from Star Wars to the Malazan Book of the Fallen. It has had tremendous influence on a lot of great creators and of stories over the years. And legitimately so. And there are some elements, though, of it that do feel, a little aged. So that's no surprise. It is, for example, told from a very omniscient point of view. The narrator is omniscient, sees into all the characters' thoughts, and will switch from one sentence or paragraph to the next, from one character's inner thoughts to another's, and that might feel a little jarring to a lot of modern fantasy readers who are probably more accustomed to a limited omniscient narrator, one that reports the inner thoughts of just one character, the POV character, for the duration. So that is one element. There's a lot of the violence that takes place off camera in Dune would be violence that you would see right in front of you in a lot of modern fantasy and science fiction, I think. So, it feels like it might, for many modern readers, even be kind of a slow pace in that sense. The plot might feel a bit slow to some modern readers of science fiction and fantasy, because a lot of that stuff happens, and a lot of the concern of the book is really more inner. It's what's going on within the characters than the external physical events, which include a lot of the violence and stuff, which is done, like I said, not on the page, so to speak, but you know it's happened. So there is that as well, but for the most part, it has aged incredibly well, and it's easy to see how influential this book has been. Some of the important tropes or archetypes or themes that you find in Dune include, of course, the coming of age, and along with that, the chosen one trope. It is a big chosen one kind of narrative in many respects, but there is some subversion of that. There are questions in here about the role of prophecy and its legitimacy, and how people can come to fit other people's expectations to fulfill a certain role. So it's not just a straight up chosen one trope, in other words. Herbert does a really great job of complicating that in here, I think, in some very interesting ways. And some of the other themes include the ecological aspects of this. This is, I'm sure everyone knows, even if you haven't read it, there's a desert setting here on Arrakis, and it is very harsh and unforgiving, and that plays a big part in the story. And ecology, also implying a sense of the connection of human beings to the landscape around them, to the world around them. This is a really big thing because tribalism is a big part of this. So ecology and tribalism, these are two themes that are pretty relevant these days, I would say, and probably even more so than ever, more so than when Frank Herbert wrote this in the 1960s, I would say. So big deal there. And transcendence, our capacity to transcend our tribalism is a big thing. And one of the elements in there that really brings this home to me, and this is not a spoiler, I'm pretty sure, because most people know they are giant worms in Dune. And these giant worms, they are vast, okay? And they offer a certain perspective to the tiny, puny little humans who witness them. They offer the perspective that we are not the center of the universe, that there are other creatures out there that we don't even have a tiny bit of understanding of, and that we are also connected to everything in some way or other, that we can live in a kind of symbiosis with all these other creatures. And that's a beautiful thing. That's a cool thing I really love that Frank Herbert does in this book. That is one of the big things that hit me while reading it, especially this time around, this idea of transcendence. So I really love that. And that is something that our main character, Paul, experiences not only in relation to the worms, but in relation to the tribe, the society around him, and to the vastness of human history. So, and that sense of connection to the past and to the future is a strong component here in Dune. So it's something I really enjoyed. Speaking of connection to the past, parental relationships, another big theme in here in Dune, something that I think is really well done. The main characters, particularly his relationship with his father and his mother, is a pretty central aspect of this as well. And how you live up to that and how you come to a certain point in your life when your relationship to your parents evolves, when you realize that they're part of a unit that you are not part of, and that there is a moment of letting go and growing up and all of that. So really beautiful stuff in there. There's also loyalty and politics. A big part of the plot in here is very political, and there's a kind of harshness to this and an extremity in terms of the measures that many of the characters have to take to ensure their survival against their political rivals, is a kind of paranoia that drives the plot that's really well done. It's a really great aspect of this. Long before Game of Thrones did it, long before Song of Ice and Fire, that is, and other great stories, you had some really interesting political intrigue here that really drives the plot and keeps the tension high. A lot of tension in here. Even though it's not as visceral as modern genre fiction, as modern fantasy or science fiction, there's a lot of tension in here, I found. And speaking of tension, sometimes people complain about the epigraphs. There are epigraphs for every chapter in Dune. And I guess the main complaint would be, well, the epigraphs actually give away certain important plot elements. And you could argue that takes away tension. But I would actually argue the opposite, that the epigraphs increase the tension. Yes, we know that certain characters survive the story because of the epigraphs. They tell us in the epigraphs, you can put two and two together. However, because the epigraphs give us additional information about the characters, perhaps their motives, it adds a certain poignancy to certain moments, which I can't talk about in detail because this is non-spoiler, but it adds certain poignancy to certain moments in the story. When, for example, and this is hit heavy and early on, is something you learn about right from the beginning in these epigraphs. There is a betrayal that happens in this story, and it's a major part of the plot, but it is given away early on. But the fact that we know from the epigraphs who the betrayer is doesn't take away from the tension of that, because we get extra elements of this betrayer as the betrayer sees things internally and as the betrayer is perceived from the outside. And that's kind of cool. That is something that Frank Herbert does. He gives you multiple perspectives. So he gives you, every character has a point of view of the other character, and then we shift, like not even from chapter to chapter. Like I said before, it's from POV to POV can change in a sentence. and you get the inner thoughts. So, but back to the epigraphs, they really do add, I think, to the fullness of this experience. They add layers to this that are very cool, and they hint at what epigraphs do. This is what they do. They hint at what's to come, thematically speaking. So yes, maybe on a surface level, on just the plot level, they give stuff away, but they add so much richness to the experience of the story that it's well worth it, in my opinion. So it's just that bigger stuff versus the surface level plot. So, well, another element of this that I think you could say might have aged a little bit, and this might be a bit of a controversial statement for some people, but I don't think it's a bad thing at all, actually. I think that what the characters are done very effectively in Dune, very effectively. But compared to a lot of modern genre fiction, fantasy, science fiction, you tend to have characters that are a bit flatter. And I don't mean that as a bad thing at all. Flat characters serve a purpose. They can be symbolic. They fulfill a certain role, a certain archetype. For example, I think it's fair to say that we all recognize what sort of person Duke Leto is. He's a father figure. And there is a sort of hidden soft side to him that we all recognize, an attachment to family. But there is also a ruthless, hard side to this character. He is a patriarch. He is an aristocrat, right, with royal blood in his veins. So, and this is a figure we recognize from many, many stories. Just to give one other more modern example, like Dalinar in the Stormlight Archive. We recognize this figure. Now, that doesn't mean that Duke Leto is poorly sketched. He's actually very richly sketched and well done. He may not be three-dimensional. He may be dominated by these certain aspects of his personality that we recognize as part of this character type. And that's okay, because it's done really well in Dune. He fulfills that role really well. The same could be said of Jessica, although she is, I think, more fleshed out than Leto. We get more of her inner thoughts. We get more of her journey. So I think she's, possibly along with Paul, the biggest exceptions to an extent to what I'm saying about these characters being more flat than modern characters in genre fiction tend to be. And I'm not saying they're totally flat either, by the way. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying they're on the spectrum of flat and round. You know, round being what we tend to see more and more these days with character-focused genre fiction. I would say that the characters in Dune are a little closer to the flat side than we're used to these days. So that's just a little thing. And honestly, I think they're done very effectively. And they play these roles really, really well. Like Gurney Halleck and Duncan Idaho are the lovable sidekick soldier types, you have others that serve their purpose too. A sort of surrogate father figure in Stilgar. You have Chani, who is the bride, right? And she plays a certain, I think, recognizable part. There's not a ton of psychological depth, and they play these roles really well. This is especially true of the villains in the story, the Harkonnens. The Baron Harkonnen, he certainly has his quirks. He's different in some ways with, his appearance and the apparatus that surrounds him, that sort of holds him up, if you will. So there's a lot about him that's different and interesting, but he is a recognizable villain with the typical villain type motives. And that's the same is true of all the other Harkonnens. So there's a little bit of nuance in the character Yua, I would say, and I'm not even sure you would want to count him among the villains either, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that even he plays a certain recognizable role here. And they're very effective. So effective with their touches of individuality that I found myself very emotionally attached to these characters. And there's a lot of emotional resonance in this book. So it's not just a cerebral experience, it's an emotional experience as well. I found myself quite moved in places. I would say I just really loved this book. I'm so glad I reread it after 30 years. Highly recommend it, especially if you're thinking about seeing the film, which I'm definitely hoping to do. And and it's a classic in and of itself, film or no film. It's just so worth reading, but I do hope the film brings lots of new readers to this amazing story. And that's it from me from now. Till next time.